There is something underneath Australia that most people never think about. You picture the continent and you think of the surface. You think of red desert and gum trees and long flat roads that go nowhere for hours. You think of the coast, the reef, the cities clinging to the edges like they are afraid of the interior. That is the Australia most people carry in their minds. A vast, sun-beaten surface stretching from one ocean to another. But underneath that surface, there is another country entirely. A country of dark passages and flooded galleries and chambers so enormous that a cathedral would fit inside them without touching the walls. A country of bones and ancient water and geological formations that took longer to grow than the entire history of human civilization. A country where the rules of time work differently, where a scientist can crawl through a tunnel and find herself standing beside evidence of something that happened before the pyramids existed, before Stonehenge was built, before any written record of any human event anywhere on Earth. This underground country is older than almost anything you can name. Parts of it formed hundreds of millions of years ago, long before the first dinosaur walked the surface. Other parts formed more recently, geologically speaking, which still means tens of thousands of years. And scattered throughout these passages, in chambers that saw no light for millennia before the first torch arrived, there are things that historians and geologists and archaeologists have not been able to explain. Things that do not fit. Things that suggest the caves beneath Australia carry stories that the official record has not yet learned to tell. Tonight, we are going down into those caves. We are going slowly because a story told in the dark deserves patience. We are going carefully because the underground world rewards attention. And we are going together because some of these places are strange enough that you want company when you visit them, even if only in the way that a voice in your headphones can be company, which I hope mine is. Australia has more than 4,000 known cave systems. That number grows every year as cavers push deeper into passages nobody has mapped and divers hold their breath in flooded tunnels that have never been touched by human hands. The continent sits on some of the most cave-productive geology on Earth. Limestone that accumulated over hundreds of millions of years. Volcanic basalt that cooled into tubes. Granite and sandstone and dolomite riddled with fractures. And solution channels and collapse chambers. The underground geography of Australia is, in several honest senses of the word, incomprehensible. We do not know how far it goes. We do not know what is in all of it. We do not know what some of what we have already found actually means. That last part is what concerns us tonight. Because the caves beneath Australia do not just raise geological questions, they raise historical ones. Archaeological ones. Questions about when people first arrived on this continent and how they lived and what they understood about the world. Questions about animals that no longer exist and how they died and why the record of their dying is concentrated in certain underground places in ways that nobody has fully accounted for. Questions about formations and inscriptions and spatial arrangements that have been studied by serious scholars for decades, and that still, after all that study, produce more disagreement than consensus. I want to be clear about something before we begin. I am not going to tell you tonight that ancient civilizations built secret tunnels beneath Australia, or that aliens carved passages into the bedrock, or that there is some suppressed knowledge that powerful institutions are hiding from the public. I have no patience for that kind of story, and neither, I suspect, do you. What I'm going to tell you is something I find considerably more interesting than any of that. I'm going to tell you what we actually know, and what we actually do not know, and where the genuine line between those two things sits. That line is strange enough on its own. You will not need anything added to it. The oldest human presence confirmed in any Australian cave goes back more than 46,000 years. 46,000 years. Let that number sit in your mind for a moment and feel what it actually weighs. When those first people moved through those underground chambers with whatever light they carried, Europe was in the grip of an ice age. The Americas had not yet received their first human visitors. Egypt was 35,000 years away from existing. Rome was 45,000 years away. The printing press, the steam engine, the internet, the entirety of what we call recorded history, all of that happened in the last 4,000 years. And those people were underground in Australian caves 46,000 years before any of it began. What they did in those caves, what they understood about what was in those caves, what they made and marked and left behind. Those questions are not fully answered. Some of them may never be. And then there are the things in the caves that predate even those first human visitors. The bones, the formations, the geological structures that point toward history so deep and so strange that even professional geologists sometimes describe them in terms that sound almost like wonder. That is where we are going tonight. Into the dark, into the old places, into the questions that have not yet found their answers. There are 20 of them waiting for us, 20 chambers to explore, 20 stories from the underground world beneath Australia that historians and scientists are still working to understand. The first one starts in the dark, as they all do. Let us begin. Number 1. The Nullarbor Plain and what nobody expected to find beneath it. The name Nullarbor comes from the Latin, nullus arbor, no tree. And if you have ever stood on the Nullarbor Plain and looked in any direction, you understand immediately why someone reached for Latin to describe it. It is one of the flattest, most treeless, most relentlessly exposed landscapes on the planet. It runs for roughly 200,000 square kilometres across the southern edge of Australia, from Western Australia into South Australia. A limestone plateau so flat and so empty that the air highway crosses it in a more or less straight line for hundreds of kilometres with essentially nothing to look at in any direction. From above, the Nullarbor looks like nothing. From below, it is one of the great geological wonders of the world. Beneath that flat surface lies the Nullarbor Cave system, which is not a single cave, but a vast interconnected network of passages, chambers, and flooded tunnels that extends for hundreds of kilometers and drops to depths that cavers are still measuring. The limestone that makes up the Nullarbor Plain is ancient. It was deposited on the floor of a shallow sea more than 25 million years ago, during the Eocene period, when the continent was positioned differently and a warm inland sea covered much of the southern interior. As the sea retreated, the limestone was exposed to rainfall, which is slightly acidic, and over millions of years that weak acid dissolved the rock along fracture lines and bedding planes until the underground became a labyrinth. The caves themselves were not discovered by European Australians until the 20th century. This is remarkable. The Nullarbor Plain was crossed by land as early as 1841 by Edward John Eyre, one of the most punishing overland journeys in Australian exploration history. The telegraph line went through in the 1870s, settlements appeared along the railway, and through all of that, the cave entrances, which are called blowholes, sat in the limestone and breathed, sometimes visibly, producing a rush of air when atmospheric pressure changed and nobody followed them down. The first serious exploration of the Nullarbor Caves did not begin until the 1950s, when a small number of cavers started lowering themselves through the vertical shafts in the surface limestone. What they found disoriented them in the most productive way possible. The passages below were enormous. There were lakes of water so still and so clear that you could see the floor 12 meters below the surface without distortion. There were chambers where no light had ever penetrated, and there were bones. The bones were the first sign that the underground Nullarbor carried history as well as geology. The ancient lake beds in the cave system contain the skeletal remains of animals that died here between 10,000 and 400,000 years ago. Thylacines, the Tasmanian tiger, which disappeared from the mainland long before European settlement. Giant wombats, Diprotodon, the largest marsupial that ever lived, the size of a rhinoceros, its bones lying in the permanent dark of a chamber it entered when it was still alive and could not find its way back out. And in some locations, the remains of animals that are not yet fully identified, fragments of bone that belong to species not yet catalogued, waiting for the research that will eventually name them. What the historians cannot explain is not the presence of the bones. Animals fell into cave systems and died. That is not mysterious. What they cannot fully explain is the pattern of the bones. In certain chambers, the accumulation is too dense to be accounted for by random falling. The assemblages look more like a place animals returned to repeatedly, or were brought to repeatedly. The question of what exactly created those concentrations has not been resolved. Then there are the scratches. In 2020, a team of researchers conducting a systematic survey of the Nullarbor Cave walls found finger markings in a chamber that had no known previous human entry. The markings, made by drawing fingers across soft cave wall sediment, are similar to markings found in European caves, where they are thought to date back 40,000 years or more. In the Nullarbor, the markings have not yet been definitively dated, but the style and the placement are consistent with the oldest category of known human mark-making anywhere on Earth. Who made them, when, what they meant by them. The chamber offers no further information. The walls hold the marks and say nothing else. That is the Nullarbor from beneath. 100 kilometers of silence that turns out to be full of questions. Number 2, Kunalda Cave and the marks that are older than almost anything. You drive west from Adelaide, deep into the Nullarbor, and eventually you reach a place called Kunalda Station, a cattle property in the far west of South Australia that sits on limestone country and has, in its heart, one of the most archaeologically significant caves in Australia. The entrance to Kunalda Cave is a large sloping collapse, 30 meters wide and 40 meters deep, which opens into a series of passages that descend further into the earth and eventually reach an underground lake approximately 100 meters below the surface. The lake is what drew people down here. The Nullarbor is one of the driest places on Earth. Fresh water is extremely difficult to find on the surface, but underneath in the limestone, water pools and chambers that stay dark and cool and sheltered from the evaporation that consumes every surface water source for hundreds of kilometers. Aboriginal people knew about Kunalda Cave. They came here for the water, probably for tens of thousands of years, descending into the dark with whatever light they could carry, moving along walls they could feel with their hands even when they could not see them. And as they moved along those walls, they left marks. The marks at Kunalda Cave were first studied seriously in the late 1950s and early 1960s by a researcher named Alexander Gallus, who recorded what he found and published findings that caused considerable debate. The walls of the cave, in the sections away from the entrance where natural light does not reach, are covered in lines, hundreds of them, thousands of them, made by dragging fingers across the soft surface of the cave wall, or in some cases by using a tool, pressing into the limestone and drawing horizontal lines, vertical lines, grid patterns, and complex interlocking traceries that in some places cover entire panels of wall from floor to ceiling. The age of the markings has been debated since their discovery. Direct dating of the finger marks themselves is technically difficult, but the cave's archaeology places human activity here at least 22,000 years ago, and possibly as far back as 24,000 years ago. That would make the Kunalda marks contemporary with, or older than, the famous cave art at Lascaux in France, which dates to approximately 17,000 years ago, and with the Chauvet cave art in France, which dates to approximately 36,000 years ago. In other words, the people who made marks on the walls of Kunalda Cave were doing so at a time when the making of marks on cave walls was one of the most cognitively sophisticated things happening anywhere on Earth. What the marks mean is the question that has not been answered. Some researchers have argued that they are pure process, the physical trace of people feeling their way along a dark passage, their hands trailing the wall for guidance. Under this interpretation, they are not symbolic at all, simply marks left by bodies moving through darkness. But this does not account for the grid patterns and the complex interlocking designs, which require deliberate construction rather than incidental contact. You do not accidentally make a grid by trailing your hand along a wall. Grids require intention. Others have argued that the marks are symbolic, possibly related to ceremonies conducted in the cave, or to the altered states of perception that extended periods in complete darkness and sensory deprivation are known to produce in human minds. There is a body of neuropsychological research suggesting that the human brain, deprived of sensory input for long enough, begins to generate its own imagery, phosphene patterns, and geometric forms that have a consistent structure across individuals regardless of cultural background. Under this interpretation, some of the marks at Kunalda might be attempts to record what the cave itself showed the people who spent long enough inside it. This interpretation has not been proven. It has also not been disproven. What has been established is that the Kunalda marks represent one of the oldest confirmed examples of human mark making in Australia, possibly the oldest, and that their meaning remains unknown. We know someone was here 22,000 years ago in the dark, and they pressed their fingers into the soft stone and drew lines. We do not know what they were thinking when they did it. We do not know what the lines communicated to the person making them, to any person who came after. We do not know if the person who made them understood themselves to be making something significant, or something private, or something functional. The cave holds the marks and keeps the reason for them. It has done so for 20,000 years. It is in no particular hurry to explain itself. Number 3. The Cocklebiddy Cave and the dive nobody should have survived, still on the Nullarbor, because the Nullarbor has more than one story to tell. In 1983, a team of cave divers from France entered Cocklebiddy Cave on the Nullarbor Plain, and swam into a flooded underground passage that would become one of the longest cave dives ever completed at that time. The leader of the team was a man named Francis Le Guin. The conditions inside Cocklebiddy are worth describing because they explain why what happened there has not been repeated in full in the decades since. Cocklebiddy Cave begins as a dry passage. You walk in through a large entrance in the limestone surface and move through chambers and passages for several hundred meters before you reach the water. The water is the beginning of an underwater tunnel that continues essentially without interruption for a distance that the 1983 French team measured at approximately 6 kilometers before they ran out of the line they were using to navigate back to the surface. 6 kilometers of flooded limestone passage in complete darkness, at depths that in some places exceeded 20 meters below the water's surface, which is itself already underground, carrying enough air to go in and come back out, which is the fundamental equation of cave diving and the one that kills people most often when it is miscalculated. The French team survived. They established what was at the time a world record for the longest cave dive ever conducted. But what they found at the end of their 6 kilometers of guideline before they turned back was not the end of the passage. The tunnel continued. They simply ran out of the ability to go further and return safely. Subsequent expeditions have extended the explored length of the Cocklebiddy Sump, which is the technical term for a flooded cave passage, to approximately 6.2 kilometers. This still does not represent the end of the passage. The flooded tunnel continues beyond the current limit of exploration. Nobody knows how far. This is the geological mystery of Cocklebiddy. The tunnel exists. Its dimensions are consistent. It is not geologically a random formation. It looks like a conduit, a structure with a direction and a purpose in hydrological terms, a path that water carved over millions of years to move from one place to another through the limestone. Conduits like this should have a source and an outlet. They should connect to something. The Cocklebiddy Sump connects to the dry cave passage at one end. At the other end, beyond the limit of human exploration, it connects to nothing yet mapped. The questions the historians struggle with here are secondary to the geological ones, but they are present. Aboriginal people knew the Nullarbor Caves in the vicinity of Cocklebiddy. There is evidence of human use of the dry entrance passages. The extent to which the original inhabitants understood the geography of the flooded passages beyond the sump entry is unknown. The oral traditions of the people of the Nullarbor region include references to water and underground places, but the specific knowledge of what lies inside Cocklebiddy is not part of any recorded tradition that researchers have been able to access. So we have a passage that continues for at least 6 kilometers underwater and possibly much further. We have a hydrological mystery about where it goes and what it connects to. And we have, at the dry entrance to that mystery, evidence that human beings live beside it for tens of thousands of years and understood it in ways that are no longer available to us. The water inside Cocklebiddy is still, very still. In a flooded underground passage with no current and no disturbance, water will stay motionless for years. The French divers said afterward that the visibility in some sections was extraordinary. You could see the tunnel walls 30 meters away in either direction. The passage was so clear and so silent and so utterly removed from everything on the surface that several members of the team described it afterward using a single word. Beautiful. That seems right to me, even at this distance. Even told in the way I'm telling it, in the dark, slowly, there is something beautiful about a passage that long and that clear and that old, holding its water in the limestone and waiting for whoever comes next. Number 4, the Victoria Fossil Cave and the animal bones that rewrote a timeline. Naracoorte is a town in the southeast of South Australia, about 3 hours drive from Adelaide, on the flat agricultural land near the Victorian border. It is a small town and an unremarkable one in most respects, except for what is underneath the paddocks to its south. Underneath those paddocks is a cave system, a dense network of solution passages in Oligocene limestone, and inside those passages is one of the most significant fossil deposits ever discovered on the Australian continent. The caves at Naracoorte have been known since the 1840s. Settlers found them, explored them partially, and used some sections as tourist destinations from the 1880s onward. But for most of that early period, the caves were appreciated primarily for their formations, the stalactites and stalagmites that grow in the chambers where water drips from the ceiling carrying dissolved limestone, depositing it in shapes that look impossibly patient because they are. A stalactite 1 meter long may represent 100,000 years of growth. The paleontological significance of the Naracoorte Caves was not understood until the 1960s, when a researcher named Rod Wells began a systematic excavation of a chamber called Victoria Fossil Cave. What he found there, and what subsequent excavations have continued to find over the decades since, is a fossil record of Australian megafauna spanning more than 500,000 years. 500,000 years of bones accumulated in a cave chamber that functioned as a natural trap. The entrance to Victoria Fossil Cave, in its original configuration before modification, was a narrow shaft in the ceiling of the chamber. Animals walking across the limestone surface above would sometimes step over that shaft and fall in. Once inside, with no way to climb the smooth vertical walls and no other exit, they died. Their bones accumulated on the chamber floor. New bones arrived on top of old ones. Over thousands of generations of animals, the deposit built up into an archive so complete and so chronologically rich that it is now recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and studied by paleontologists from institutions around the world. The animals in the deposit are extraordinary. There is Diprotodon, the giant wombat relative, present in large numbers. There is Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, an animal about the size of a leopard with retractable claws, and a bite force that modern analysis has shown was proportionally stronger than any living carnivore of comparable size. There is Procoptodon goliah, the short-faced giant kangaroo, which stood nearly 3 meters tall and could not hop in the manner of modern kangaroos because its build was too massive. There are species of wombat twice the size of the largest living wombat, and there are, in the upper layers of the deposit, the bones of animals that survived long enough to be contemporary with the first humans in Australia. this is where the history gets complicated. The megafauna of Australia disappeared, not gradually and not everywhere at once, but in a general extinction event that took out the majority of large animal species, sometime between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago. The causes of that extinction are one of the most debated questions in Australian paleontology. There are two primary hypotheses: human hunting pressure, which argues that the arrival of humans on the continent and their predation of naive megafauna species drove the large animals to extinction, and climate change, which argues that shifts in rainfall and vegetation patterns at the end of the Pleistocene made the continent inhospitable to the megafauna regardless of human activity. The Naracoorte fossil record is important to this debate because it is one of the few places where the timeline is precise enough to be useful. The bones tell a story of megafauna abundance, then decline, and in the upper layers, a marked change in the species composition of the deposit that corresponds roughly to the period of human arrival. But roughly is not precisely, and the precise timing of Australian megafauna extinction in this location is still argued. Some researchers read the Naracoorte record as supporting human causation. Others find the climate signal equally compelling. What is not disputed is that the cave holds the answer, somewhere in its stratified layers of bone and sediment. We simply have not been able to read the answer with enough resolution to be certain. Number 5. The Wellington Caves and the bones that should not have been there. We should go to Wellington in central western New South Wales, about 5 hours west of Sydney, where the Macquarie River cuts through limestone country and a system of caves opens into the hillside above the river. The Wellington Caves are not, by Australian standards, an enormous system. The chambers are beautiful and the formations are remarkable, but they are not the size of some of the other caves we have discussed or will discuss. What makes Wellington historically significant is not its scale. It is its bones and the story of who found them and what happened when the finding was announced. In 1830, a European-Australian farmer named George Rankin lowered himself into a cave on his property near Wellington and found himself standing in a chamber littered with the fossilized remains of large animals. He had no scientific training and no framework for interpreting what he saw, but he recognized that the bones were unusual, and he wrote about them to a man named Thomas Mitchell, who was then Surveyor General of New South Wales and also something of a natural historian. Mitchell visited the caves and was astonished. The bones were large, much larger than any living Australian animal. They were fossilized, which meant they were old, and they were abundant. Mitchell reported his findings, and the discovery eventually came to the attention of one of the most important scientific figures of the early 19th century. Richard Owen, the British anatomist who would later coin the word dinosaur, received bone specimens from the Wellington Caves and spent considerable time analyzing them. What Owen determined, and what subsequent researchers have confirmed and expanded upon, is that the Wellington Caves bones represent at least 23 species of animals, most of them extinct, many of them belonging to that same megafauna assemblage present at Naracoorte. Diprotodon was here. So was a giant kangaroo. So was a giant bird, Genus newtoni, which stood nearly 2 meters tall and weighed in the range of 220 kilograms. But the discovery that created the most difficulty for 19th century science was something else entirely. Mixed in with the megafauna bones in the same deposit, in what appeared to be the same geological stratum, were bone fragments that Owen and others recognized as human. Not modern intrusions, not bones from a recent burial that had somehow filtered down into the older deposit. Bones that appeared to be genuinely ancient, contemporary with the megafauna whose remains surrounded them. This created a significant problem. In 1830, the prevailing scientific consensus in Europe held that the Earth was approximately 6,000 years old, a figure derived from biblical genealogies. The megafauna were understood to have been antediluvian, creatures from before Noah's flood, which was itself understood as a historical event. Under this framework, the discovery of human bones mixed with the bones of antediluvian megafauna should have been impossible because humans were created after the flood, not before it. Some researchers tried to explain the Wellington bones as a disturbance, arguing that the human fragments had been washed down from above and only appeared to be in the same stratum as the megafauna. Others accepted the evidence and drew the uncomfortable conclusion. Humans had been in Australia long enough to be contemporary with animals that everyone agreed were very, very old. The debate over the Wellington bones fed into a much larger debate about the age of the Earth and the age of humanity that occupied Victorian science for decades. The cave did not care about the controversy it had started. It simply held its bones and let the people above argue about what they meant. What the Wellington Caves tell us now, 2 centuries after Rankin crawled into the chamber, is that the question of human antiquity in Australia was being asked seriously, if poorly, much earlier than most people realize. The answers were not available with 19th century tools. With modern methods, we know that humans and Australian megafauna were indeed contemporary for at least several thousand years, and possibly tens of thousands of years. The argument that started in a cave above the Macquarie River in 1830 was asking the right question. It just had to wait a very long time for the tools that could answer it. Number 6, the Jenolan Caves and the 340 million year mystery. The Jenolan Caves are the most visited caves in Australia. They sit in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, carved into limestone, and they have been a tourist destination since the 1860s. They are genuinely spectacular, the formations are extraordinary, and the access is easy enough that several 100,000 people walk through them every year without any special equipment or training. By many measures, they are the most familiar caves in the country. They are also, by geological measurement, among the oldest open caves on Earth. The age of Jenolan has been the subject of a long and sometimes contentious scientific argument. Cave age is technically defined as the age of the void, the moment when the passage or chamber was first opened by geological processes and became hollow. This is distinct from the age of the rock surrounding the cave, which in Jenolan's case is limestone from the Silurian and Devonian periods, between 340 and 420 million years old. The rock is not the cave, the rock is what the cave is carved into. Dating the cave itself requires dating materials that formed inside the void after it was created. Stalactites and stalagmites can be dated using uranium-thorium methods, which measure the decay of radioactive elements in the calcite. Studies published in the 2000s by researchers from several Australian universities produced dates for some of the Speleothem formations in Jenolan that push the cave's age back to approximately 340 million years. 340 million years. For context, the first reptiles appeared on Earth approximately 312 million years ago. The dinosaurs did not appear until approximately 230 million years ago. The continents were arranged very differently. Australia, as a separate continent, did not exist. The land that would eventually become Australia was part of the supercontinent Gondwana, and the cave that would eventually become Jenolan was already there, or something very close to what it would become was already there, underground in the limestone. This makes Jenolan the oldest known open cave system on Earth by a significant margin, and this creates a question that geologists still find difficult to fully answer. How did it survive? Caves are geologically fragile. Over millions of years, the processes that create caves, acidic water dissolving limestone, also tend to enlarge them until the ceilings collapse and the caves are destroyed. The formation of new cave material, new speleothems, also tends to fill in passages over very long periods of time. A cave 340 million years old by the standard models should not still exist as an open system. It should have either collapsed or filled in or been destroyed by the erosion of the surrounding landscape millions of years ago. The explanation that researchers have proposed involves the specific hydrology of the Jenolan area. The limestone sits within a band of harder, less soluble rock that has protected it from erosion. The water table and drainage patterns have remained relatively stable over a very long period. The specific geometry of the cave has distributed stress in ways that prevent catastrophic collapse. All of these factors together may account for the survival, but the word may is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The survival of Jenolan over 340 million years is, in geological terms, anomalous. The standard models of cave development do not predict it. Jenolan is an outlier, a surviving exception to processes that should have ended it long ago, and the mechanisms of that survival are not yet completely understood. Every person who walks through the Grand Arch at Jenolan and looks up at the formations and thinks they are looking at something ancient is more correct than they probably realize. Number 7. The Undara lava tubes and the ecosystem that time forgot. Go north now, leave the limestone country of the southeast and travel to Queensland, to the savanna woodland of the inland tropics, about 250 kilometres southwest of Cairns. Here the landscape changes completely. Instead of the white and grey of limestone, the ground is dark. Dark volcanic basalt in flows that spread across the surface in all directions from a series of low volcanic cones that erupted approximately 190,000 years ago. The Undara volcanic field is not a dramatic landscape. The cones are low, the flows are old enough to be heavily vegetated, and from a distance it looks like ordinary Queensland savanna. But inside the basalt flows, beneath the surface and extending for tens of kilometres in several directions from the main vents, are the Undara lava tubes, the longest system of lava tubes on Earth. Lava tubes form differently from limestone caves. When a volcano erupts and lava flows across the surface, the outside of the flow cools and solidifies first, forming a hard crust. Inside that crust, the lava continues to move, molten and fluid, draining downslope. When the eruption ends and the molten interior drains away, it leaves behind a hollow tube inside the solid basalt shell. The Undara tubes are enormous. Some of them are 10 meters wide and 15 meters high. They run in linked sections that extend for a total of approximately 160 kilometers, though the exact length is still being mapped. The question that puzzles researchers about Undara is not geological. The formation of lava tubes is well understood. The question is ecological. Inside the tubes, cut off from the surface by the solid basalt roof and separated from the external environment by the sharp boundary between the tube interior and the outside, there are ecosystems. The tubes maintain a stable temperature of approximately 31 degrees Celsius year-round, warmer than a limestone cave because the basalt retains heat. The humidity inside is consistently very high. The entrance sections of tubes open to the surface allow the entry of organic material, bats, insects, and some light. But the interior sections, the deeper parts of the tubes, receive no light and very little input from the surface. In those interior sections, researchers have found species that exist nowhere else on Earth. Cave-adapted invertebrates, beetles, spiders, and other arthropods that have evolved in the dark of the Undara tubes over tens of thousands of years and are found in no other location, not in other caves nearby, not in the surrounding savanna, not anywhere else in Australia. These are endemic species, meaning their entire global population exists in a single cave system. The Undara tubes are, in biological terms, an island, a fragment of isolated evolutionary history that has been developing its own direction since at least the end of the last ice age and possibly much longer. The historical questions here concern the Aboriginal people who have lived on and around the Undara volcanic field for the entire time the tubes have been in their current form. The traditional custodians of the Undara country are the Iwamian people, and their knowledge of the lava tubes includes an understanding that the tubes are significant landscape features, not merely geological curiosities. The specific nature of the traditional knowledge, what the tubes represent in the Iwamian understanding of their country, is not fully documented in any public record accessible to non-Aboriginal researchers. What researchers have noted is that the tube entrances, which are prominent features in the landscape, are places where the Iwamian people historically avoided certain activities. The details of why and what the tubes represented in the traditional framework belong to the Iwamian people and are not available in the public literature. This is an appropriate boundary. Not everything that is known needs to be written down for everyone. What can be said is that the Undara tubes represent a site where geological history, ecological history, and cultural history converge, and where the full story of all three remains incomplete. The tubes are 190,000 years old. They contain species that evolved in isolation for a fraction of that time. They were known to the people of this country for thousands of years before any researcher arrived to study them. All three of those histories are real, and all three are still being understood. Number 8. The Chillagoe Caves and the maps nobody made. Still in Queensland, about 200 kilometres west of Cairns, on the edge of the Gulf country, where limestone towers rise from the red dust in formations called karst, which is the geological term for a landscape shaped by the dissolution of soluble rock. The Chillagoe karst is dramatic in a way that stops people who see it. The towers are white and grey and riddled with caves, and they rise from the flat country around them like the ruins of something vast and ancient, which is, in a geological sense, exactly what they are. The Chillagoe Caves are numerous. There are hundreds of cave entrances in the karst towers around Chillagoe, many of them connected underground in ways that have not yet been fully mapped. Some are large enough to walk through standing upright. Others require crawling. A few have never been entered by researchers because the passages are too small or too unstable or too flooded during the wet season to allow safe access. In the accessible caves, Aboriginal rock art is present in quantity. The paintings and engravings cover walls in chambers throughout the Chillagoe system, and they span a considerable range of ages. The most recent art is recent enough to have been made after contact with European settlers, depicting horses and cattle alongside older motifs. The oldest art has not been directly dated, but is consistent in style with art from other North Queensland sites that places it in a range of several thousand years at minimum. The paintings include figures that researchers have interpreted as representational, animals, human figures, and objects that might be tools or ceremonial items. They also include a category of marking that has resisted interpretation. In several of the Chillagoe caves, there are painted marks that researchers have described as possibly schematic, meaning possibly representing something in plan or map form, the way a diagram represents an object or a landscape from above. These marks are not like the representational figures. They are arrangements of lines and dots and geometric shapes that do not obviously correspond to any animal or human form. They are also not purely random. They have structure, they repeat, they appear to follow internal rules. The suggestion that some of these marks might represent a schematic understanding of the cave system, a kind of spatial record of what the passages look like from above, was first made in passing by researchers in the 1970s and has never been seriously pursued or definitively rejected. The evidence for this interpretation is not strong. The evidence against it is not strong either. What it would mean, if true, would be significant. It would mean that Aboriginal people in North Queensland were making spatial representations of underground geography in the very caves that the representations depicted, possibly thousands of years ago. This is not a proven thing. It is a noticed thing, a pattern that has been observed and not yet explained. The caves hold the marks, and the marks suggest a question that nobody has yet answered in a systematic way. The question of what spatial and geographic knowledge Aboriginal Australians encoded in their art and oral traditions is one of the most important and least studied questions in Australian archaeology. There is substantial evidence from separate research entirely that detailed geographic information about landscape features was preserved in songlines and oral traditions for periods measured in thousands of years. The question of whether similar information was ever encoded in visual form on cave walls in caves that the information was about is one that nobody has yet fully asked. Number 9. The Naracoorte Caves and the day the Megafauna died. We return briefly to Naracoorte because it has more to give us than the fossil record alone. We established in number 4 that the caves contain 500,000 years of megafauna remains in their deposits. What we did not discuss is the upper boundary of that record, the layer near the surface of the deposit that corresponds to the moment when the megafauna disappear from the archive. That disappearance is abrupt. This needs some qualification because abrupt in paleontological terms means something different from what it means in ordinary life. The disappearance of the megafauna from the Naracoorte record is abrupt the way a door closing is abrupt, compared to the slow erosion of a cliff face over 10,000 years. It still represents a period that may be measured in centuries, but in the context of a deposit that spans 500,000 years, a change that happens in centuries is effectively sudden. What was there before the boundary and what is there after it are completely different assemblages of species. Below the boundary, the full suite of megafauna. Diprotodon, marsupial lion, giant kangaroo, giant wombat, all of them present, their bones mixed together and the accumulations of thousands of years of the trap working as it always worked, animals walking over the shaft and falling in. Above the boundary, those species are gone. The bones that appear in the upper layers are from smaller animals, wallabies, possums, common wombats, animals that are still living in Australia today. The transition is sharp enough that it can be located in the deposit. You can put your hand on the layer where the megafauna end. You cannot do that in many places. Researchers have tried to date that layer with the highest precision the available methods allow. The dates cluster around 44,000 to 46,000 years before present. That is the same period, within the uncertainty of the measurements, as the earliest confirmed human presence in Australia. It does not prove that humans caused the extinction. It proves that the extinction happened at the same time as the arrival of humans. Correlation is not causation, as every scientist must remind themselves. But a correlation this tight across multiple sites at a continental scale is a fact that requires accounting for. The climate change hypothesis argues that the period around 44,000 years ago was one of increasing aridity across Australia, and that the megafauna, already stressed by changing vegetation, could not sustain the additional pressure. This is true as a description of the climate. Whether it is true as an explanation for the extinction requires a demonstration that previous periods of comparable aridity, of which there were several in the preceding 500,000 years, did not produce comparable extinctions. The Naracoorte record is informative here, because the lower deposits do pass through periods of identified climate change without showing the same pattern of megafauna disappearance. This finding has been cited as evidence against the climate hypothesis, or at least as evidence that climate alone is insufficient. The megafauna survived multiple climate perturbations over 500,000 years. They did not survive the one that coincided with human arrival. Whether that coincidence is evidence of causation or evidence that the specific climate event at 44,000 years ago was uniquely severe in ways that earlier events were not remains debated. The cave at Naracoorte holds the record of that disappearance in its layers. It is the most precise record we have in this country of an event that changed the ecology of the continent permanently. Whatever caused the megafauna extinction, and the honest answer is that we do not yet know with certainty, it was one of the most consequential events in Australian natural history. The bones in the dark at Naracoorte are the closest thing we have to a witness account. Number 10. The Tantanula Cave and the passage that should not exist. The Tantanula Cave is in the southeast of South Australia, near the coast, not far from the Victorian border. It is a smaller cave than most of the ones we've discussed, a modest single-chamber system in limestone, with modest formations and a modest history of tourist visitation going back to the 1880s. By the standards of Australian caves, it is, in most respects, unremarkable, except for the passage at its back. The Tantanula Cave has a single large chamber that is accessible to visitors. At the back of that chamber, there is a continuation, a narrow passage that leads deeper into the limestone. This passage has been known since the cave's discovery. It has been entered by researchers. It has been surveyed to a limited extent, and it presents a geological problem that nobody has satisfactorily resolved. The passage descends steeply before becoming too narrow for human entry. Beyond the narrowing, based on the airflow and the acoustic properties of the space, researchers have concluded that the passage continues into a larger chamber or void. The airflow is the key indicator. Air moves through the narrow section with enough volume and consistency to indicate that there is a substantial open space on the other side. A narrow passage that ended against solid rock would not produce significant airflow. This one does. The size and nature of what is beyond the narrowing is unknown. Attempts to insert cameras into the narrowing have produced limited results because the passage bends before reaching whatever space lies beyond it. The airflow has been measured and modeled, and the models suggest a void of at least several hundred cubic meters, which would make it a chamber comparable in size to the accessible portion of the cave. This is interesting, but not, on its own, especially mysterious. Undiscovered cave chambers are not rare. They exist behind impassable narrowings in cave systems all over Australia and all over the world. The fact that this one cannot be reached does not make it a mystery. What makes it a problem is the geology. The limestone at Tantanula, based on the surface geology and the drilling records from water bores in the area, should not contain a large void at the depth and location indicated by the airflow modeling. The geological conditions that typically produce large solution chambers are not present at the scale required. The rock is the wrong age, the wrong chemistry, and the wrong stratigraphic position to have produced, by normal processes, a chamber of the size the airflow suggests. Researchers who have examined this problem have not proposed a satisfying explanation. The chamber, if it exists at the size the evidence implies, is an anomaly. Something created it that is not straightforwardly explained by the standard processes of cave development. The more prosaic explanations involve incomplete knowledge of the local geology. Subsurface geology is always partly inferential. What is known from surface observations and bore records may not capture all the relevant features of the rock below. The anomaly may be more apparent than real, a product of measurement error or modeling assumptions that do not match the actual geology, or the passage leads somewhere that requires a different explanation. Nobody knows. The narrowing is too narrow, the bend is too sharp, and the air continues to move through it, from somewhere that has not been reached towards something that has not been seen. Number 11, the Yarrangobilly Caves and the river underground. The snowy mountains of New South Wales are famous for cold and altitude and the hydroelectric scheme that transformed the region in the 20th century. They are not famous for caves, but they have them, in a band of Silurian limestone that runs through the range, and within that band, the Yarrangobilly Caves are the most significant. They sit about 480 kilometres south of Sydney, tucked into the wall of the Yarrangobilly Gorge, at an elevation of about 1,000 metres. The caves were discovered by European settlers in the 1850s and formally opened for tourist visits in the 1880s. By then, they were already understood to be remarkable formations in a spectacular setting. The gorge itself is dramatic, the Yarrangobilly River cutting through the limestone over millions of years, and the caves are part of that story, formed by the same water that carved the gorge, working its way through fractures in the limestone over geological time. What researchers noticed, and what has never been fully resolved, is that the Yarrangobilly cave system appears to be considerably larger than the accessible portions suggest. The water that moves through the Yarrangobilly limestone is substantial. The river sinks into the limestone in several places upstream, disappearing into the rock and traveling through passages that are not accessible to human entry before re-emerging downstream. This process, called sinking and resurgence, is well documented in limestone country worldwide. But at Yarrangobilly, the volume of water involved and the difference between where it sinks and where it resurges points to a cave system in the limestone that is much more extensive than the chambers that have been explored and mapped. Dye tracing, which involves injecting fluorescent dye into a sinking stream and monitoring where it re-emerges, has been used to track some of these underground water paths. The traces confirm that water is traveling significant distances through the limestone, along passages that cannot be entered. In some cases, the paths are longer than the surface distance between sink and resurgence, meaning the water is not traveling in a straight line underground, but following a meandering route through a complex passage system. The full extent of that passage system has never been mapped because the passages themselves are too small, or too flooded, or too deep to allow human access. What exists beyond the accessible caves of Yarrangobilly is a matter of inference rather than direct observation. The Aboriginal significance of the Yarrangobilly area is substantial. The Naracoorte people, whose country includes the Snowy Mountains region, have a long history in this landscape, which includes the underground water and the caves above it. The caves feature in the landscape knowledge of the Naracoorte, and the gorge as a whole is a significant feature in the cultural geography of the region. The specific relationship between the Naracoorte and the cave system, what the caves represented, what was done in or near them, and what knowledge was maintained about them, is not fully documented in any accessible record. The hydrological mystery and the cultural significance exist in the same place, separated only by the incompleteness of two different kinds of record. Number 12, the Margaret River Caves and the time capsules nobody opened. The southwest corner of Western Australia, the region around Margaret River, is known primarily for wine and surfing. It is a beautiful part of the country, the Karri forests and the limestone coast and the long beaches that face the Southern Ocean. What it is not known for, outside of the communities of cavers and researchers who work there, is that beneath the ridge country south of Margaret River lies one of the most cave-dense regions in Australia. There are more than 150 known caves in the Leeuwin Naturaliste Ridge, the spine of limestone that runs along the Western Australian coast between Cape Leeuwin and Cape Naturaliste. They include some of the most spectacular formations in the country: stalactites and stalagmites, shoal formations, helictites growing in directions that seem to defy gravity because they formed in conditions of very low airflow where surface tension matters more than weight. The caves are extraordinary. They are also, in their deepest and most inaccessible parts, essentially unstudied. The publicly accessible caves, Mammoth Cave, Lake Cave, Jewel Cave, and others, have been researched to a significant degree. Their formations have been dated, their sediments analyzed, their fossil content catalogued. Mammoth Cave is particularly significant for its megafauna fossil assemblage, which includes the remains of Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, and Zygomaturus trilobus, a diprotodon relative. These are well documented, but the system extends. Beyond the tourist sections, beyond the accessible passages, the limestone continues, and in the limestone, more caves. Caves that have been entered but not surveyed, caves that have been located by surface evidence, by doline patterns and airflow, but not entered because the access is too difficult or the passage is too tight. Caves that no researcher has yet reached. In 2008, a team of researchers studying the Leeuwin Naturaliste Caves located what they described as a promising undescribed passage in the limestone south of the known systems. The passage showed airflow characteristics consistent with a significant void beyond. Attempts to access it through existing cave passages were unsuccessful. Attempts to locate an entrance from the surface were also unsuccessful. The passage is in the record as a located but unentered target. It remains unentered. The Noongar people of the southwest, who have been on this country for at least 45,000 years, have a cultural landscape in the Leeuwin Naturaliste area that includes the caves. The specific nature of the Noongar relationship with the caves, what they represent, what activities occurred in or near them, and what knowledge was maintained about the landscape as a whole is documented only partially and incompletely in the available literature. The caves have been significant to the Noongar people for far longer than they have been significant to anyone else, and the majority of that significance exists in a form of knowledge that was not designed to be transmitted through written records to researchers outside the community. What the Margaret River Caves are, in the full sense of what they represent to the country they are in, is not yet completely known to the people who study them. Number 13. The Buchan Caves and the Gold Rush secret that was never written down. The Buchan Caves are in East Gippsland, in the mountains of Victoria, about 350 kilometres east of Melbourne. They are beautiful caves, two main accessible systems called the Fairy Cave and the Royal Cave, in limestone that was deposited in the Devonian period and has been dissolving slowly ever since. The historical significance of Buchan is not in the geology. It is in what happened in the limestone country around the caves during the Victorian gold rush of the 1850s. The goldfields of Victoria attracted an enormous movement of people between 1851 and the late 1860s. The Gippsland goldfields, which included the Buchan area, were not the richest fields in the colony, but they attracted their share of prospectors, some of whom operated claims in the limestone country near the caves. The specific details of what was found and where during this period are incompletely recorded, in part because prospectors were not in the habit of sharing specific information about their finds with anyone, and in part because the official record keeping of the Colonial Goldfields Administration was inconsistent. What is known is that the Buchan limestone contains mineralization. The rock chemistry in the Devonian limestone of East Gippsland is compatible with the concentration of gold and other metallic minerals in veins associated with fracture zones. This is geology, not history, but it is relevant to a series of stories that circulated in the Buchan district from the gold rush period onward, and that have never been conclusively resolved. The stories, which exist in local oral tradition and in a small number of written accounts from the late 19th century, describe the discovery of significant gold deposits in caves or underground passages near the limestone country. The accounts vary in their specifics, but share a common element. The described deposits were not registered with the Colonial Mining Authority. They were worked privately for a period, and the locations of the deposits were not communicated beyond a small circle. This is not inherently surprising. The private working of unregistered deposits was common in the Victorian goldfields, particularly in the later period when the easy surface deposits were exhausted and the hard work of underground mining required capital and secrecy. What is surprising, and what has attracted the occasional researcher to the Buchan stories, is the scale of the deposits described. If the accounts are even partially accurate, the material involved was substantial enough to have left some physical trace in the landscape. No such trace has been definitively identified. The more skeptical reading of the Buchan Cave gold stories is that they are simply mining folklore, the kind of story that attaches to any district with a gold history, inflated by time and the tendency of people to make their grandfather's stories more interesting than they probably were. There are hundreds of similar stories from Victorian goldfields districts, and the vast majority of them lead nowhere. The less skeptical reading notes that the limestone country around Buchan has not been thoroughly surveyed for underground mineral deposits, that the cave systems are extensive enough to contain passages that have not been entered, and that the specific chemistry of the local geology is genuinely compatible with gold concentration in the way the stories describe. Nobody has resolved this. It may never be resolved, but the stories exist, and they have existed for 170 years, and the caves around Buchan are still not fully mapped. Number 14. The Capricorn Caves and the solstice that has happened for thousands of years. North of Rockhampton in central Queensland, there is a system of caves in a limestone tower called the Caves, because people in this part of Queensland did not always trouble themselves with elaborate nomenclature. The caves themselves have been given a more commercial name, the Capricorn Caves, which refers to the Tropic of Capricorn that passes nearby. The caves are known to tourists primarily for their formations, and for a natural phenomenon that occurs once a year in the main chamber of the cave. In the days around the summer solstice in the southern hemisphere late December, when the sun is at its southernmost point in the sky, sunlight enters the cave through a natural chimney in the ceiling and falls directly on the floor of the main chamber in a precise circle of light. The geometry of the chimney in the chamber is such that this alignment only occurs within a few days of the solstice. At other times of year, the light either misses the chimney entirely or strikes the wall rather than the floor. This kind of natural solar alignment in a cave is not unprecedented. The most famous examples are at New Grange in Ireland and the Sun Dagger site in Chaco Canyon in the United States, where similar alignments between cave architecture and solstice sunlight appear to have been deliberately constructed by ancient people. At Capricorn, the alignment appears to be natural. The chimney is a geological formation, not a human-made aperture. The geometry is a consequence of the cave's natural orientation relative to the sun, not a design. But the cave was used by Aboriginal people before European contact. This is not disputed. The archaeological record in the Capricorn Caves includes evidence of human occupation across a substantial time depth. The caves were part of the landscape knowledge of the Aboriginal people of the Rockhampton district, and the limestone towers of the area appear in the cultural geography of the region. What is not known, and what researchers have not resolved, is whether the annual light event was known to the people who used the cave before European contact, and if so, what significance it held. The question sounds simple, but it is actually quite complex. To establish that the light event was known and valued by Aboriginal people would require either a documented oral tradition referring to it, or archaeological evidence of activity in the chamber concentrated in the period around the solstice. Neither of these lines of evidence is conclusively present. The oral traditions associated with the site have not been fully documented or made available in the public record in a form that addresses this question. The archaeology of the site has not been studied at a resolution that would allow the seasonal timing of human activities to be established. So we have a natural solar alignment in a cave that has been used by human beings for thousands of years, and we do not know whether those human beings understood and made meaning of the alignment that happened there once a year. The answer is almost certainly yes, in one form or another. People who live closely with the landscape observe it carefully. An annual event in a cave you use regularly is not the kind of thing that goes unnoticed, but almost certainly is not the same as documented, and the documentation is incomplete. Number 15. The Aranda people and the underground country that was never hidden. The Aranda people, also written as Arante, are the traditional custodians of a large area of Central Australia that includes Alice Springs and the ranges and desert country surrounding it. Their country is not, geographically, a land of caves in the way that the limestone country of the south or the karst country of Queensland is. It is red sandstone and quartzite and the ancient worn-down roots of mountains that were once among the highest on Earth. But there are caves in Aranda country, not limestone solution caves, but rock shelters, cliffs undercut by wind and water erosion, and a significant number of deeper passages in the sandstone and quartzite that qualify as caves by the technical definition of a void in rock, with more horizontal than vertical extent. The Aranda relationship with these underground and sheltered places is profound and extensively documented, more extensively than the relationship of most Australian Aboriginal groups with their cave landscapes, because the Aranda attracted the attention of some of the most serious anthropological researchers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The work of Baldwin Spencer and Frank Gillen, published in the Native Tribes of Central Australia in 1899 and subsequent volumes, remains one of the most detailed early records of Aboriginal cosmology and practice in Australia. What Spencer and Gillen documented, and what subsequent researchers have expanded and refined, is a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between underground places and the most foundational elements of Aranda cosmology. The dreaming, which is an inadequate English translation of a concept that does not map cleanly onto any equivalent in European thought, describes the foundational creative acts and beings that establish the world. The dreaming is not a pastime, or not only a pastime. It is an ongoing condition of the world, a layer of reality that underlies and informs the visible surface. Underground places for the Aranda are not simply geological features. They are places where the surface world and the dreaming world are thin between each other. Specific caves and rock shelters are understood as the locations where ancestral beings entered or emerged from the earth, or as the places where the power of the dreaming is concentrated and accessible to those who know the correct relationships and protocols. This understanding of underground places as sites of cosmological significance is not unique to the Aranda. Similar frameworks exist across many Australian Aboriginal traditions. But the Aranda case is particularly well documented, and it illustrates a broader point that is important for understanding the relationship between Aboriginal Australians and the cave systems of the continent. The caves beneath Australia were never unknown to the people who have lived above them. They were intimately known, in some cases for tens of thousands of years, within a framework of understanding that was not geological or archaeological, but cosmological and relational. The questions that modern researchers ask about the caves, their age, their extent, their contents, their meaning, have answers within that traditional framework that are not available through research methods and are not designed to be. This creates a fundamental asymmetry in the knowledge landscape. The caves have been known for a very long time. They have been understood in ways that our research methods cannot replicate. And the knowledge that was developed over those tens of thousands of years of sustained attention to the underground country of this continent is only partially available to the researchers who study those same places today. The mystery of the Australian caves is partly a geological mystery, but it is also, in a significant way, a mystery created by the limits of who is asking the questions and which answers are considered valid. Number 16. The surveyor who mapped what nobody believed. In the colonial period, the mapping of Australia's interior was a project that consumed the lives of a significant number of remarkable people. The surveyors and explorers who moved through unknown country with chains and theodolites and sketchbooks were doing important work in dangerous conditions, and most of what they recorded has been thoroughly absorbed into the official record, checked against later surveys, and incorporated into our understanding of the landscape. But some of what they recorded was not absorbed. Some of what they found was set aside, labeled improbable or anomalous, or the product of faulty observation, and not followed up. The case of Frederick George Scott is one of these stories. Scott was a surveyor employed by the South Australian government in the 1870s and early 1880s. He worked primarily in the far north of the colony, in country that was then only partially explored, and he produced competent work that was accepted and integrated into the official maps without controversy. He was, by the record, a reliable and methodical observer. In 1882, Scott submitted a report to the Surveyor General's office that described the discovery of what he termed a subterranean system of considerable extent in the limestone country northwest of Lake Eyre, which is now called Kadithanda Lake Eyre. The report described a series of cave entrances and a low limestone escarpment, the presence of airflow from the entrances consistent with a large connected system, and the discovery of a body of cave art at one entrance that Scott described in some detail. The art included hand stencils, which are widespread in Australian rock art, and a category of marking that Scott described as map-like, representing a landscape with underground features indicated. The Surveyor General's office received the report and filed it. There is no record of a follow-up expedition. The area Scott described was not surveyed in detail for another 20 years, And when it was, the survey recorded limestone country with surface dolines consistent with cave development, but did not specifically note cave entrances of the kind Scott described. Scott's report sits in the South Australian State Records Archive. Researchers working on the history of Australian cave exploration located it in the 1990s and attempted to interpret its geographic references. The location Scott describes is plausible, in country that is known to have cave development. The art he describes, particularly the map-like markings, is consistent with things that have been found elsewhere in similar limestone districts. The cave entrances he described have not been definitively relocated. This may be because the entrances are in country that is difficult to access and has not been searched systematically. It may be because the entrances are present but subtle, the kind of feature that reveals itself to a person on foot who knows what to look for and is invisible from any other distance. It may be because erosion or collapse in the century and a half since Scott's survey has changed the surface expression of the system. Or it may be because Scott's observation was inaccurate in ways that the distance of 140 years makes impossible to assess. The report is in the archive. The country is still mostly limestone. The caves, if they exist as Scott described them, have not been found again. Number 17. Modern cave divers and what they keep finding. Cave diving is not a sport with a large membership. The combination of skills required, diving competence, cave navigation competence, technical equipment management, and a particular kind of calm risk tolerance produces a community of practitioners that is small in number and tends to be intense in character. In Australia, that community has, over the past 50 years, pushed into flooded cave systems that were previously unknown and produced discoveries that have consistently surprised the geological community. The Nullarbor cave diving program is the most significant of these, and it is ongoing. Every year, conditions permitting, teams enter the flooded tunnels of the Nullarbor Caves and extend the mapped portions a little further. The discoveries are not always dramatic. Some years the extension is a few hundred meters of passage, similar to what came before, but occasionally the extension produces a new chamber, a new gallery, a new connection between systems that were previously thought to be separate. In 2017, a small team working in a system in the central Nullarbor connected two passages that had been explored from opposite ends for years and were suspected but not confirmed to be linked. The connection established that the two systems were part of a single continuous cave, which became, at its measured length, one of the 10 longest underwater caves in the world. This is a significant discovery, and it received almost no attention outside the caving community. The Jewel Cave system in Western Australia presented a similar story in the 2000s, when cave divers working in flooded passages at the deepest accessible points of the cave extended their exploration into passages that had not been entered before, and found fossil material in conditions of preservation that were described by the researchers who subsequently studied it as exceptional. The fossils were of Pleistocene age, between 10,000 and 125,000 years old, and included species not previously recorded from the southwest of Western Australia. The pattern that emerges from the history of modern cave diving in Australia is consistent. Every time a team of skilled divers pushes further into an Australian cave system, they find more than was predicted. The systems are larger than the surface geology suggests. The fossil content is richer than expected. The connections between systems that were thought to be separate turn out to exist. The discoveries keep accumulating, and the picture of the Australian underground that emerges from each year of discovery is larger and more complex than the picture it replaced. This is not mysterious in the sense of being inexplicable. It is what you would expect from the systematic exploration of an incompletely known landscape. But it is significant as a measure of how far the exploration has yet to go. If every year of dedicated effort by skilled specialists produces significant new discoveries, the scale of the unknown that remains is very large indeed. Researchers who think about this professionally have described the Australian cave system as one of the least explored significant geological features in the world. By the measures available, less than 20% of the cave passage that exists in Australian limestone has been entered and mapped. The remaining 80% is in flooded passages, in tight passages below current technical limits, in cave systems that have not yet been located from the surface, and in countries so remote that access is logistically prohibitive with current resources. What is in those unexplored passages is unknown. Given what has been found in every explored section so far, the answer is almost certainly more fossil material, more endemic biological communities, more geological formations, and more surprises. Number 18. The photography anomaly and the formations that should not grow that way. Across several of the cave systems we've discussed, and in a number of others that do not have a specific narrative attached to them, researchers have noticed something about the Speleothem formations, the stalactites, stalagmites, flowstones, and other calcite deposits that grow where water drips through a cave. The formations grow according to well-understood processes. Water-carrying dissolved calcium carbonate drips from a ceiling, loses carbon dioxide as it hits the cave air, and deposits a tiny amount of calcium carbonate at the drip point. Over thousands of years, those deposits accumulate into the formations that make caves famous. The growth of formations depends on several factors: the rate of water drip, the chemistry of the water, the temperature and humidity of the cave atmosphere, and the geometry of the space. These factors together determine the shape and direction of growth. In principle, a stalactite grows straight down because of gravity, and a stalagmite grows straight up below the drip point, and the shapes produced are predictable within a range of variation. In practice, there are formations in Australian caves that are not growing in the directions the models predict, and that are not growing in shapes that the standard processes produce. The most striking category of anomalous formation is the helictite. Helictites are cave formations that grow in apparently arbitrary directions, twisting and curving and branching in shapes that seem to ignore gravity entirely. Individual helictites in Australian caves have been observed to grow horizontally, downward at angles that do not correspond to the drip direction, and in spiral forms that would require the water to travel in a spiral around the outside of the formation. The mechanisms of helictite growth are debated. The most widely accepted explanation involves capillary forces operating at the very fine scale of the crystal growth, where surface tension can overcome gravity at the tiny scale of individual crystal faces. But this explanation does not fully account for all observed helictite forms, and some formations in Australian caves have shapes that remain mechanistically unexplained. Beyond the helictites, there are location anomalies. In several Australian cave systems, formations are present in positions that do not correspond to current or recent water sources. They are growing, or recently grew, in sections of cave where no water currently drips and where no obvious mechanism for past water delivery to that location is apparent. These formations are not old enough to have been produced when the cave was wetter overall. They are young enough that the water source that produced them should be traceable, and it is not. The most careful explanation for these anomalies involves microclimatic variations in cave airflow that cause localized condensation and drip. Water condenses on cool surfaces and then drips from them in patterns that can be very localized and very different from the bulk water flow pattern in the cave. This is a plausible mechanism, and it probably accounts for many of the location anomalies. It does not yet account for all of them. Cave formation science is mature in many respects and still surprising in others. Australia's caves, with their age and their variety of geological settings, keep producing examples that sit at the edges of the current models. Not the kind of anomaly that suggests the models are fundamentally wrong, but the kind that suggests they are not yet complete. Number 19. What every theory gets wrong about the time. We have moved through 18 chambers of this underground country. We have looked at bones and marks and geological anomalies and historical puzzles and knowledge systems that are older than any of the structures that history books typically describe. We are close to the surface now, in the sense of being close to the place where we stop and turn and try to make sense of what we have seen. But before we do that, I want to spend some time on the thing that I think runs through all of these stories, and that I do not think has been given enough weight in most of the discussions about Australian caves that I've encountered. The thing is time, specifically the way that the timescales involved in the Australian underground world are consistently underestimated by people thinking about them for the first time, and how that underestimation produces distorted conclusions. Consider the Kunalda finger marks, 22,000 years old. That number is stated, it is large, it registers as significant, and then it is placed in the category of ancient things and the analysis proceeds. What is not often done, what requires some effort to actually do, is to sit with the number and feel its real weight. 22,000 years ago is not ancient in the way that the word ancient usually means in cultural contexts. Ancient usually means a few thousand years, Roman or Egyptian ancient. 22,000 years is not that kind of ancient. It is a span of time that is nearly impossible to hold in the mind without deliberate effort. It is more than twice the length of all recorded history. It is 10 times the age of the oldest written text. It is long enough that the coastline of Australia looks substantially different when those marks were made, because the sea level was much lower at the last glacial maximum, and the continent extended further into what is now the ocean. The people who made those marks were not primitive versions of modern people doing primitive things. They were cognitively modern humans doing things that we have not yet learned to fully interpret, in a landscape that no longer exactly exists, in a time so remote that the very coastline of the country has changed significantly since they were there. Or consider the Nullarbor Caves. The limestone is 25 million years old. The cave system formed over millions of years after that. The megafauna whose bones lie in the dark of the cave lake beds were present in that landscape for hundreds of thousands of years before disappearing in a blink, geologically speaking, about 45,000 years ago. The Aboriginal people who have known the Nullarbor since before the megafauna disappeared have held that knowledge continuously for something in the range of 45,000 years. 45,000 years of continuous knowledge of a landscape. That is not comparable to anything in the written historical record. There is no written tradition anywhere on Earth that is 45,000 years old. The oldest writing in the world is about 5,000 years old. The oldest oral traditions that have been continuously transmitted and verified against physical evidence, such as the Aboriginal traditions about sea level rise that researchers have confirmed, correspond to real geological events, extend back more than 10,000 years. The knowledge that the Aboriginal people of Australia hold about the caves beneath their country is not a remnant, not a fragment, not a degraded shadow of something that was once richer. It is a living tradition that has been continuously maintained for a time period so long that the geological landscape of Australia has measurably changed since it began. Some of the caves that were entered 22,000 years ago are now underwater because the sea level has risen since then. The theories that researchers bring to bear on the Australian caves, the paleontological theories, the geological theories, the archaeological theories, are powerful tools. They have produced genuine knowledge, but they operate within a framework of time that is much shorter than the time frame of the objects they study, and they have access to only a portion of the knowledge that exists about those objects. The Aboriginal knowledge of the caves is not available in full to researchers, and it is not the purpose of researchers to extract it. Every theory about what the caves mean, why the bones are there, what the marks indicate, what the unexplored passages contain, operates with less than the full information that exists in the world about those caves. That is not a failure of research. It is a consequence of the specific history of this country and the forms of knowledge that that history produced. The caves know more than we have asked them, and some of what they know has already been asked and answered in a language that we have not yet learned to read. Number 20. The question that has never been answered. We are in the last chamber now, the deepest one. The one where the questions do not resolve but clarify. Here is the question that runs beneath all of the others we have discussed tonight. Why is there so much of the Australian underground world that remains genuinely unknown? Not unknown in the sense of unexplored, because unexplored places are common everywhere and the reasons are usually logistical. Not unknown in the sense of undocumented, because documentation is a finite resource, and some caves simply have not been visited often enough to produce records. Unknown in a more specific sense. Unknown despite significant research effort. Unknown in ways that have produced active scientific disagreement about the most basic facts. How old? How extensive? What caused this? Who was here? The caves of Australia have been studied seriously for more than 100 years. The universities of this country have geology departments, archaeology departments, biology departments, paleontology programs. The caves are accessible enough, most of them, that researchers can reach them with reasonable effort. The funding for cave research, while never lavish, has supported sustained programs of investigation. And still, after all of that, the list of things we do not know about the Australian underground world is longer than the list of things we do. I have been thinking about why that is, and I have arrived at an answer that I think is honest, even if it is not flattering. The unknown in the Australian caves is partly geological. The systems are genuinely enormous, genuinely complex, and genuinely difficult to access in their inaccessible portions. No amount of funding will allow a human body to enter a passage that is too narrow for a human body. No research program will illuminate the contents of a flooded tunnel until the technology of cave diving advances enough to allow safe entry. These are real limits, and they account for a real portion of the unknown. But another portion of the unknown is a consequence of the history of research itself. The caves were not approached as unknown places by the researchers who arrived to study them. They were approached as places that already contained knowledge in the framework of the people who had been living with them for tens of thousands of years, and that framework was not the framework that the arriving researchers used. The disconnection between those two frameworks means that a substantial body of knowledge about the caves was not transferred into the research record, and the research record therefore has gaps that are not geological gaps but epistemological ones. Gaps not in the caves but in the way the caves have been studied. The honest appraisal of the state of knowledge about Australian caves is something like this. We know a great deal about the geology of some of them. We know a significant amount about the paleontology of a few of them. We know something about the archaeology of some portions of some of them. We know very little about the traditional knowledge systems that developed over 45,000 years of human attention to these places. And we know even less about how those knowledge systems intersect with or complement or contradict the findings of research science. What we do not know fills a much larger space than what we know. And the most honest position any researcher can take, looking at the Australian cave record in full, is that the unknown is where the most interesting questions are. Some of those questions will be answered by technology. The next generation of cave diving equipment will allow access to passages that are currently inaccessible. New dating methods will resolve chronological debates that current methods cannot settle. New analytical techniques will extract information from rock and bone and sediment that current methods cannot reach. The unknown will shrink on those fronts. But some of the questions are not questions that technology will answer because they are questions about meaning rather than mechanism. What did the marks mean? What did the underground world represent to the people who lived above it and entered it for tens of thousands of years? What do the caves know in the sense of what knowledge has been maintained about them in traditions that were not designed to be recorded? Those questions will not be answered by better equipment or more precise dating. They will be answered, if they are answered, through the kinds of relationships between research communities and traditional knowledge holders that take decades to build and require a genuine redistribution of interpretive authority from the researchers to the people whose country the caves are in. Some of those relationships are being built right now between Australian universities and Aboriginal communities in cave country across the continent. The results are not yet fully visible in the published literature because the work is slow and the trust is appropriately cautious. But it is happening. The caves beneath Australia have been waiting for 45,000 years, in some cases longer. They can wait a little more for the questions to be asked in the right way, by the right people, in the right relationship. They are very patient caves. They are, by the measure of the time they have existed, among the most patient things on Earth. And they are full of answers that the right questions, asked in the right way, might yet bring into the light. Outro, that is where we stop tonight. 20 chambers, 20 stories, and a great deal of darkness still around us as we turn back toward the entrance and the surface. I want to say one thing before you go, or before you fall asleep, which is something I hope this kind of slow, careful exploration of a complicated place can help with. The world is old in ways that are genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. The places that carry that oldness most directly, the caves, the deep water, the very ancient rock that makes up the fabric of continents, those places are not mysterious because someone is hiding the truth about them. They are mysterious because the truth about them is so large and so old that no single tradition of knowing, not science and not traditional knowledge and not anything in between, has been able to hold all of it at once. That is not a failure. That is what honest inquiry looks like when the subject is genuinely vast. Australia is full of those vast subjects. The caves beneath it are one of them. The people who have known those caves for longer than any building in the world has existed are another. The way those two things, the geology and the human knowledge, have only very recently begun to be studied in their actual relationship to each other. That is perhaps the most important story of all. I am grateful you came down here with me tonight. I hope you sleep well, somewhere safe and warm above all of this ancient dark. And if you find yourself thinking somewhere between now and sleep about what it would be like to be in a flooded limestone tunnel 6 kilometers from the entrance, in water so clear you can see 30 meters in every direction, in complete silence except for your own breathing and the sound of your regulator, with the walls of the cave going past you in the torchlight and the passage continuing ahead further than you can follow tonight, I hope you find that thought restful rather than frightening. It is, I think, one of the most extraordinary things that exists in this country, and most people who live above it will never know it is there. That seems worth remembering. Good night. Supplementary Chapter A, The Caves Beneath the Sea. There is something that deserves its own chapter, something we mentioned in passing earlier, and that I want to return to in more detail, because it is one of the most disorienting facts I know about the Australian cave record, and I think it deserves more than a brief mention. When the Aboriginal people first arrived in Australia, somewhere between 50 and 65,000 years ago, the continent was physically different from the one that exists today. The difference is not subtle. The sea level during the last glacial maximum, when the great ice sheets of the northern hemisphere locked up enormous quantities of water that would otherwise flow back to the sea, was approximately 125 meters lower than it is now. 125 meters, not a few meters, which would move a coastline slightly, not 10 or 20 meters, which would expose some continental shelf. 125 meters, which exposed a completely different continent. The Australia that the first people arrived in was roughly a third larger than the Australia that exists today. The land that is now covered by shallow sea along the continental shelf, the Sahel Shelf in the northwest, the vast submerged plains off the coast of Western Australia, the areas of Bass Strait between Tasmania and the mainland, all of that was land, dry land, habitable land in most cases, land that people could walk across, build camps on, dig wells in, and live their lives in for thousands of years. And in the limestone country of that now submerged land, there were caves. This is not speculation. The continental shelf off the coast of southern and western Australia contains extensive limestone formations. The limestone was above sea level during the glacial maximum. Limestone above sea level, exposed to slightly acidic rainfall over tens of thousands of years, develops cave systems. The caves on the now submerged limestone of the Australian continental shelf are as certain a prediction as geology makes. They existed, they formed. Animals lived in them or fell into them, and given that the people who arrived in Australia 50 to 65,000 years ago were living on land that is now underwater, it is probable that some of those caves were known to and possibly used by those first Australians. We cannot study these caves with current technology. The depths involved, combined with the distance from shore and the conditions of the open ocean, make them inaccessible. They are there, almost certainly. We cannot reach them. But they contain something that nothing above the current sea level can contain. They contain the record of the Australia that existed before the sea reclaimed the coast. The middens, the hearths, the campsites, the bones, the art on the walls of the rock shelters that formed in that limestone country before the water rose, all of it is underwater. All of it is in the dark, at depths below the reach of any current diving technology. Researchers who work on the archaeology of the glacial period in Australia have described this as the single greatest gap in the record. The first 20,000 years of human habitation of this continent, the period from arrival to the end of the glacial maximum, is almost entirely invisible to archaeology because the landscapes where those people lived are now underwater. What we know about the earliest Australians comes from inland sites where the elevation was high enough to survive the sea level rise. It does not come from the coast, where most people would be expected to have lived because the coast is gone. The caves in the now submerged limestone are part of that lost record. Not the most important part perhaps, but a part. And the fact that they are there, that they almost certainly contain evidence of human occupation in the earliest period of Australian prehistory, and that we cannot reach them, is one of the most significant limitations in our understanding of Australian history. When the sea level was rising at the end of the glacial maximum, it rose relatively slowly on human timescales, not overnight. Over centuries and millennia, people would have experienced the sea coming in across the land that their grandparents had known as solid ground. Camps that had been used for generations would have been abandoned as the water approached. Caves that had been significant places would have gradually flooded. Some of the oral traditions about sea level rise that researchers have documented from Aboriginal communities describe this process. The memory of land going underwater is preserved in stories that can be verified against the geological record. The caves that went underwater are part of what was lost in that rising, and the stories that remember the rising are the closest thing to a record of what those caves once contained. The knowledge of what was in those underwater caves is not scientific knowledge. It is a different kind of knowing, preserved in a different form, for a different audience. And it is, in the full sense of the word, what remains of a record that the sea has otherwise covered. Supplementary Chapter B. The temperature of the dark. Something I want to tell you about because it is not widely known and because it is relevant to understanding how Aboriginal people use cave systems over thousands of years, is the thermal property of Australian caves. Most people understand at a general level that caves tend to be cooler than the outside in summer and warmer in winter. This is because the rock mass around a cave moderates temperature, evening out the extremes of the surface climate and producing an interior that stays close to the mean annual temperature of the region year-round. In a temperate climate, this means cave temperatures sit around 12 to 15 degrees Celsius, regardless of season. But Australia is not a temperate country in most of its area. The interior of Australia, where most of the limestone cave systems sit, experiences surface temperatures that range from below zero on winter nights to above 50 degrees Celsius on summer days. The swing between those extremes can be 60 degrees or more across the year. A cave in this country, maintaining its stable interior temperature at something close to the mean annual average, might be 20 degrees warmer than the outside on a winter night and 25 degrees cooler than the outside on a summer day. This is not a luxury. In a landscape with surface temperatures above 50 degrees Celsius, Access to a space that is 25 degrees cooler is the difference between surviving and not surviving. The energy budget of a human body in extreme heat is severe. Without shelter from direct sun and high ambient air temperatures, a person without adequate water can be in life-threatening heat stress in a matter of hours. The caves of the Australian interior are natural thermal shelters of a kind that have no parallel in most other landscapes. The constant temperature of a deep cave in the Australian outback during a summer heatwave would feel to a human body like extraordinary relief. The air inside is not just cooler, it is moister, because evaporation from cave walls and underground water maintains high relative humidity, even when the outside is extremely dry. Researchers studying the use of caves by Aboriginal people in the Australian interior have identified in the archaeology consistent evidence of heavy use during the hottest seasons of the year. The occupation deposits are thicker for summer periods. The species of animals represented in the food remains are ones that are accessible during summer. The pattern is consistent with cave use as a thermal strategy, an adaptation to the extreme heat of the Australian interior that involves spending the hottest parts of the day underground, where the temperature was physiologically manageable, and moving on the surface primarily during the cooler periods of morning, evening, and night. This is elegant. It is the kind of knowledge, the kind of deep, practical understanding of the physical properties of a landscape that you develop over many thousands of years of paying close attention to how the world works around you. The caves were not just sacred places or water sources or places where interesting bones appeared. They were thermal refugia, reliable sanctuaries from the most extreme temperature conditions the Australian interior could produce. Understanding this changes how you read the archaeological record of Australian caves. The density of occupation deposits is not just a function of social use or ceremonial significance. It is also a function of a thermal strategy that used the physics of cave environments to buffer the extremes of the surface climate. The caves were, in a literal and physiological sense, livable in ways that the summer surface was not. The formations inside those caves, the stalactites and stalagmites that drip in the cool dark, are the products of those same thermal conditions. The cave maintains its temperature because it is enclosed by rock, and the rock maintains its moisture because the temperature is stable, and the formations grow because the moisture carries dissolved minerals. And the formations take thousands of years to grow because the process is slow, and the slowness of the process is evidence of how long the conditions have been stable. The cave that sheltered a person from 50-degree heat today was sheltering people from 50-degree heat 10,000 years ago. The conditions that produce the stalactite also produce the shelter. They are the same phenomenon. Supplementary Chapter C. The sound that caves make. One of the stranger areas of cave research, one that is growing in interest among archaeologists who study prehistoric art, concerns the acoustic properties of decorated caves. The question at the heart of this research is whether the placement of art in caves, the specific surfaces that were chosen for painting or engraving, correlates with the acoustic properties of those surfaces and the spaces near them. This research began in European decorated caves in the 1980s and 1990s, when researchers started noticing that the densest concentrations of art in some caves corresponded to areas where sound behavior was unusual, not just in the obvious sense that large chambers have better acoustics than narrow passages, but in a more specific sense. Some painted surfaces were directly above areas where sound resonates in a way that produces a pronounced echo or a sense of the sound coming from inside the rock. Some art was placed at the exact point where a hand clap produced a resonance that lasted longer than expected. Some decorated chambers were natural reverb chambers, where a voice could be heard throughout a large space with unusual clarity. The researchers who documented these correlations were careful about what they concluded. They did not argue that the art was placed specifically because of the acoustics, only that the correlation was stronger than chance and that the people making the art were in a position to experience the acoustic properties of the spaces they were working in. The extension of this work to Australian caves has been limited, partly because the research is time consuming, and partly because conducting acoustic surveys in caves that are restricted for cultural reasons requires the permission and involvement of traditional custodians. But where it has been done, the results are consistent with the European pattern. In several of the decorated caves of Australia that have been studied with acoustic methods, the placement of art correlates with the placement of natural acoustic features. Hand stencils tend to be concentrated in places where the sound from a hand clap has a noticeable quality different from the surrounding passages. Painted panels are sometimes on surfaces that are acoustically reflective in ways that plain sections of the same wall are not. The patterns are not universal. There are decorated surfaces with no special acoustic properties and acoustic features with no art near them, but the correlation is present often enough to be noted. What this might mean is significant. If the sound behavior of a cave, the way it makes certain surfaces feel alive to a struck hand or a spoken word, was relevant to the choice of where to make art, then the caves were understood by the people working in them as acoustically complex environments that had to be listened to as well as looked at. The dark is navigated partly by sound. Anyone who has spent time in a cave knows that the silence is not uniform. Different spaces sound different. Water sounds different from still air. A large chamber sounds different from a narrow passage. And a surface that produces an unusual resonance when struck is noticeably different from one that does not, in a way that you feel as much as hear. The people who made art in Australian caves 40,000 years ago were in those caves with fire for light and their own voices for sound. They would have known the acoustics of those caves intimately. Every passage they moved through in firelight produced sound information as well as visual information, and the two kinds of information together composed their experience of the underground world. Whether the acoustic properties of specific surfaces influence where they made their art is a question that is still being investigated in Australian caves. The investigations are slow and careful and require relationships and permissions that take years to establish. But the evidence so far suggests that the answer is not no. The caves sound like something they always have. The people who worked in them were listening to them, not just looking at them. And some of what they made in those caves, in the dark, by firelight, may have been made in direct response to what they heard. Supplementary Chapter D. The mapping problem and what it reveals. Cave mapping is a technical discipline with its own methods, its own specialist equipment, and its own culture. Cavers who map caves spend hours in dark, tight, wet passages, measuring distances and angles, and sketching the walls and floor and ceiling in notebooks that get wet despite every precaution. The results are maps, two-dimensional representations of three-dimensional spaces that try to capture the geometry of passages that twist and branch and overlap in ways that make representation genuinely difficult. Australia has a cave mapping tradition that goes back to the late 19th century, when the first tourist caves were being prepared for visitors, and someone had to understand how the passages connected. The tradition has developed significantly since then. Modern cave survey teams use digital instruments, laser rangefinders, and electronic data loggers that produce coordinates with millimeter precision. The maps that come out of this process are good. They are more accurate than anything produced before the digital era, and they are still only a partial picture of what is underground. The limitation of cave maps is not technical. It is definitional. A cave map shows what has been entered and measured. It does not show what has not been entered, and the spaces that have not been entered are not shown as blank. They are simply absent from the map, as if they do not exist, which is the convention in cartography, but creates a specific kind of misleading impression when applied to caves. A map of the Jenolan Caves shows the passages that have been surveyed. It does not show the geological features that strongly suggest further passage beyond the current limits of exploration. The map looks complete. It has a scale bar and a north arrow and a legend. But the absence of what is beyond the current exploration limits is invisible on the map. in a way that the absence of, say, the interior of a country on a historical map was visible as a blank space marked terra incognita. When geologists look at the maps of Australian cave systems and then look at the surface geology and the hydrology, they often notice inconsistencies. The cave extends in a direction that the geology predicts should continue, but the map ends. The cave shows evidence of a water source that the mapped passages do not connect to, implying unmapped passages that carry the water. The volume of water flowing in the cave at certain times of year is greater than the mapped passages can deliver, implying unmapped inputs. These inconsistencies are not errors in the maps. The maps are accurate representations of what has been entered and measured. The inconsistencies are indicators of what has not been entered. They are the fingerprints of the unknown, visible in the relationship between what the map shows and what the geology predicts. Researchers have been pointing to these inconsistencies in Australian cave maps for decades. Each inconsistency is a research target. Some of them have been resolved over time as exploration has extended into the predicted passages and confirmed them. Others remain unresolved. And new ones emerge every time a new area of the map is completed, because the new survey always produces new geology that implies new predictions about what lies beyond. The mapping problem is, in a sense, a philosophical problem about the nature of knowledge. We know where we have been. We can predict with some confidence where we have not been. The space between what is known and what is predicted is the frontier. In Australian caves, that frontier is enormous, and it is not shrinking as fast as might be hoped. The exploration is slow, the passages are difficult, the resources are limited. But the predictions are reliable enough to be confident that the frontier holds what we think it holds. More caves, more history, more time compressed into stone. Supplementary Chapter E. What the water remembers. The water in Australian caves is old, not old in the way that a vintage wine is old, or an antique is old, or even in the way that a 200-year-old building is old. Old in the way that geological time is old. Water that infiltrates into a cave system through the rock above it can take anywhere from months to tens of thousands of years to travel from where it entered the rock to where it emerges in the cave, depending on the geology. In deep aquifer systems, the travel time can be much longer. Water that is now dripping from the ceiling of a cave in the Nullarbor may have entered the rock during a time when the climate was different, when different animals walked above it, when the people living on the surface spoke languages that are no longer spoken anywhere. The age of water in a cave can be measured by geochemical methods. Radiocarbon dating, tritium analysis, and other techniques can establish when water entered the groundwater system and give a minimum age for specific water samples. These measurements have been made in several Australian cave systems, and the results are consistently surprising to people encountering them for the first time. In some parts of the Nullarbor Cave system, the water in underground lakes has been isolated for more than 10,000 years. It entered the rock at the end of the last glacial period, when the climate was wetter than it is now and the recharge rate of the limestone was higher, and it has been sitting in the dark in the limestone ever since. 10,000 years of stillness. The water that a cave diver swims through in the Nullarbor today may have last seen the surface of the earth before the pyramids were built. This old water carries a chemical memory. The chemistry of the water that entered the limestone reflects the atmospheric conditions and the surface chemistry of the landscape at the time of entry. By analyzing the chemical composition of water in different parts of the cave system, and by knowing how the chemistry of the water changes as it moves through the rock, researchers can reconstruct something of the environmental conditions that prevailed when the water entered. This is one of the ways that cave systems function as environmental archives, recording the climate and chemistry of past periods in forms that are accessible to modern analysis. The cave water, the Speleothem formations, the sediments on cave floors, the bones in cave deposits. All of these are records of the past preserved in the dark. But the water is a particularly poignant kind of record because it is the same water. Not a proxy, not a secondary deposit, not a transformation of something that was once different. The same water that was rain over the Nullarbor 10,000 years ago is the water that a diver moves through today. It has been underground the whole time. It has not changed except for the slow chemical adjustments that happen in the dark, the gradual equilibration with the limestone walls around it. There is something in that continuity that is worth sitting with. The water in the Nullarbor Caves is older than the oldest existing human civilization. It is older than the oldest existing writing. It has been in the dark for all of recorded history, and for a long time before it. When it eventually returns to the surface through springs and outflows and the slow movement of groundwater toward the sea, it will rejoin the water cycle that has been running since the ocean condensed on the surface of the early Earth. The cave holds it, for now, in the dark, in the cool, in the quiet, waiting for the passage back. Supplementary, Chapter F, the mid-roll moment. I want to pause here for a moment because we have been going a long time, which is exactly as it should be for a journey this long, and because I want to ask you something before we continue to the final sections. Where are you right now as you are listening to this? Are you in bed, in the dark, with the phone on your nightstand and the cave script running through your headphones? Are you on a long drive somewhere flat and the talk of Australian caves is keeping you company across the kilometers? Are you in a city with the sound of traffic outside and the underground world feels like a good place to be instead? I ask because I'm genuinely curious. The people who listen to this kind of content, slow and careful and long, tend to be people in particular circumstances. And those circumstances are interesting. Cave content specifically, in my experience, tends to reach people who are drawn to the very old and the very quiet. People who find comfort in geological time. People who are not afraid of the dark in the metaphorical sense, even if they might be in the literal one. If that is you, I would love to know. Drop a comment below this video, tell me where you are and what time it is, and if there is a particular cave story from anywhere in the world that you think I should cover in a future episode. Australian caves have more stories in them than this episode can contain, and I am already thinking about where to go next. And if you are finding this useful for sleep, which is the other reason people come to content like this, then I hope the combination of the slow pace and the interesting subject matter is doing what it is supposed to do. If you're already asleep, then I hope whatever you are dreaming is as ancient and as still as the water in the Nullarbor. We continue now with the final sections. We are almost back at the surface. Not quite yet. Supplementary Chapter G, the biological mystery of the cave fish. Australia has cave fish. This fact is not widely known, even within Australia, and the fish themselves are among the most extraordinary creatures found anywhere in the underground world of the continent. Cave fish, fish that have adapted to live their entire lives in underground water systems with no access to light, are found on every continent except Antarctica. They arise through the same general process wherever they appear. A surface fish species colonizes a cave or underground water system, either because the cave entrance provides refuge from predators, or because drought on the surface drives fish underground, or through some other circumstance. In the cave, which is dark and food limited and predator free, the fish that survive are not necessarily the ones that are most similar to their surface relatives. Natural selection in the cave environment favors very different traits. Eyesight becomes irrelevant in the dark and is energetically expensive to maintain. Eyes that are not used are not just useless, but costly. Fish that spend energy on eyes have less energy for everything else. Over many generations, cave fish populations tend to lose their eyes, or to develop vestigial eyes that no longer function, while the energy budget that would have gone into visual processing is redirected. They also tend to lose pigmentation, for similar reasons. Color is expensive to produce and maintain. In the dark, it provides no benefit. Cave fish are almost universally pale or transparent, their internal organs visible through skin that has lost the melanin that would otherwise protect against ultraviolet light, which is irrelevant underground. The Australian cave fish are found primarily in the underground water systems of the Kimberley region of Western Australia, and in isolated cave systems in the northwest of South Australia. The most studied is Yarrangobilly veritas, a small blind fish found in the Jenolan Caves of the Cape Range in Western Australia. Jenolan Caves are a specific type of cave system that connects to the sea through underground passages, so that the water in the cave fluctuates with the tides, even though the cave itself may be kilometers inland. Yarrangobilly lives in the freshwater layer at the top of the ankyline system, separated from the saltwater below by a density difference that creates a sharp interface called a halocline. The thing that makes Yarrangobilly and the other Australian cave fish scientifically significant is their isolation. The Cape Range Jenolan Caves have been cut off from the ocean for approximately 5 million years. During that time, the fish populations in those caves have been evolving in complete isolation from any other fish population. 5 million years of isolated evolution in the dark. The fish that exist in those caves today are the products of 5 million years of selection pressure from an environment that has not changed significantly in all that time, in a lineage that has had no gene flow with any outside population for the entire period. The result is creatures that have diverged so far from their surface relatives that determining what those relatives were requires molecular analysis. The morphology alone is not sufficient. They look like no other fish. What the researchers who study Australian cave fish have not yet fully resolved is the question of dispersal. How did fish get into isolated cave systems in the first place? For the Cape Range fish, the answer involves the ancient sea connections when sea level was higher, but for some inland cave fish systems, particularly in the Kimberley, the mechanism of initial colonization is not obvious. The cave systems are not connected to the surface, or not connected in ways that are visible. The fish are there, the route by which they arrived has not been traced. This is a common pattern in Australian cave biology. The organisms are present. The historical geography that would explain their presence is unclear. The underground world is old enough and complex enough that the history of how things came to be where they are is not always recoverable from the current evidence. The cave fish represent, in biological terms, a kind of time capsule. They are carrying in their genomes a record of 5 million years of underground evolution. The information in those genomes is, in principle, accessible to analysis. Researchers who have begun that analysis are finding histories in the DNA that are not visible in the morphology, additional evidence of population subdivision and isolation that the physical characteristics of the fish do not reveal. The genome is a cave inside the fish, carrying its own kind of ancient dark. Supplementary Chapter H. The ghost bats and the colony that has always been. In the sandstone caves of the Northern Territory, particularly in the cave systems that honeycomb the sandstone escarpments of what is now Kakadu National Park, there is a colony of ghost bats that researchers have been monitoring for decades. Ghost bats, Macroderma gigas, are Australia's largest carnivorous bat. They are called ghost bats because they are pale, almost white, and because they fly silently through the dark using echolocation with a call frequency that is mostly inaudible to human ears. They eat large insects, lizards, frogs, small birds, and other bats. They are remarkable animals in the biological sense of being at the top of their ecological niche in a specialized environment. The colony in the Kakadu Sandstone Caves is significant for reasons that go beyond biology. It has been in that location for a very long time. The cave system where the bats roost is the same cave system that contains some of the oldest rock art in Kakadu, art that has been dated to at least 20,000 years ago and possibly much longer. The bats were in those caves when the art was made, and the people who made the art were in caves with the bats. Ghost bat bones appear in the archaeological deposits at the base of the cave walls at Kakadu, mixed with the bones of other animals that were eaten at the site. Ghost bats were hunted and eaten. They were also depicted in the rock art. The specific imagery of ghost bats in Kakadu art is recognizable to ornithologists and biologists who study the species today, confirming that the artists were depicting something they knew directly and in detail. The continuity here is striking. The bats have been in these caves, probably continuously or nearly so, for at least 20,000 years. The people who have been associated with this country for all of that time have known the bats, hunted them, depicted them, incorporated them into the visual record they maintained on the cave walls. The relationship between the people and the bats in this specific place is one of the longest documented human-wildlife relationships anywhere in the world. It is also, in the formal scientific sense, inadequately studied. The ecology of the Kakadu ghost bat colony has been monitored but not comprehensively researched. The relationship between the colony's long history and the art that depicts it has been noted but not analysed in detail. The specific practices around the hunting of ghost bats and the cultural significance of the species to the Aboriginal communities of the Kakadu region are documented in the anthropological literature, but not in a way that connects them systematically to the cave ecology. The bats roost in the caves now, as they have for longer than any record can precisely establish. When researchers enter the caves to conduct surveys, the bats cluster in the highest, darkest recesses of the ceiling, their pale bodies just barely visible in the torchlight, watching with eyes that are adapted to a darkness that has been consistent in that location for 20,000 years. They are not disturbed by the presence of people in the cave. People have always come into these caves. The bats know this, in the way that bats know things, which is through experience compounded across generations in ways that we do not fully understand. The bats of Kakadu know that people enter caves. They've had 20,000 years to learn it. Supplementary Chapter 1. The deepest point. There is a question that people ask about caves, a reasonable and curious question, that is harder to answer for Australia than you might expect. The question is, what is the deepest point that has been reached underground in Australia? In European cave systems, this question has a relatively well-documented answer. The deepest caves in the world are in mountain country, where large vertical relief creates the conditions for cave shafts that go hundreds or thousands of meters below the surface. Veryovkina Cave in Georgia is currently the deepest known cave in the world, reaching a depth of approximately 2,212 meters below its entrance. Several other caves in the Caucasus region and in the Alps exceed 1,500 meters in depth. Australia does not have that kind of vertical relief. The continent is famously flat by world standards. The highest point, Mount Kosciuszko, is just over 2,000 meters above sea level, and the mountainous areas are restricted to the southeast. This means that Australian caves cannot develop the extreme vertical range of alpine cave systems. The deepest vertical shaft in Australia is in the south, in cave country that has modest elevation, and it reaches depths that are significant by Australian standards but modest by world standards. But this is the depth question for air-filled caves with significant vertical shafts. The question of the deepest point reached underground in Australia, including flooded passages, is different, and the answer is less certain. Cave divers working in Australian cave systems have descended to significant depths below the water table in flooded passages. In the Nullarbor, the flooded tunnels descend to depths of more than 60 meters below the water table, which itself may be a significant distance below the surface. In the anchialine systems of the Cape Range in Western Australia, researchers have descended into the halocline and into the saltwater below it, reaching considerable depths. These figures are not systematically compiled in a way that would allow a confident statement about the overall deepest point reached. What can be said with confidence is that the deepest point of the Australian cave world has not been found. The flooded systems of the Nullarbor extend to depths that have not been fully measured. The connections between cave systems that have been separately explored may, when those connections are eventually traced, create a combined depth that exceeds any single measured point. The deep aquifer systems of the Australian interior, which are hydrologically connected to the surface through the same limestone and other soluble rock that forms caves, contain water at depths that far exceed anything a diver has reached. The deepest point of the Australian underground is probably somewhere in the Nullarbor, in a flooded passage that extends to depths below the current technological limit of cave diving. That limit, for the most capable technical divers with the best available equipment, is currently around 350 meters below the water surface. The passages that go beyond that point are, for now, off the map. What is at the deepest point of the Australian underground, if anyone ever reaches it, is in the category of unknowns that this whole conversation has been circling. The answer is probably more rock, more water, more silence, and more time. That seems like enough. Supplementary Chapter J, The Cave That Gives Breath. There is a practice in Australian caving culture, informal and not widely documented but present among the community of regular cave visitors, of referring to certain cave entrances as breathing caves. This is not a technical term. It is the word that people use when they stand at a cave entrance and feel the air moving across their face. Caves breathe. This is not metaphor, it is physics. The cave system underground contains a volume of air that is at a stable temperature year-round. The surface air above the cave entrance is at the temperature of the surface, which changes with the seasons. When the surface is hotter than the cave interior, which in Australia is much of the year, the hot surface air is less dense than the cool cave air, and the cave exhales, pushing cooler air upward through its entrances. When the surface is cooler than the cave interior, the cave inhales, drawing in the denser cold air from outside. The result is that most cave entrances in Australia, at most times of year, have a detectable airflow. In summer, the air flows outward, cool cave air rising against the hot surface air, and it can be felt and sometimes heard. In winter, the airflow reverses, surface air drawn in by the warmer cave interior, and it can be felt as a cold inward pull at the entrance. The Aboriginal people of Australia notice this. There is a long tradition of caving entrances being understood as special places, not only because of what is inside them, but because of this breathing quality, this evidence that the underground world is alive in some literal sense, taking in and releasing air in response to the world above. The breathing of a cave is not the same as the breathing of an animal, but it has a recognizable quality in common with it. Something's happening, something's responding. The rock is not inert. Researchers studying the acoustic and atmospheric properties of decorated caves have found, in some European contexts, that the placement of art near cave entrances correlates with the placement near the breathing points, the spots where airflow is strongest and most reliably felt. Whether this correlation exists in Australian decorated caves has not been systematically studied, but the breathing caves are real. If you stand at the entrance of a large cave in the Australian summer and hold your hand in front of you, you will feel the cool air moving past your fingers from the dark below. The cave is exhaling. It has been exhaling in summer and inhaling in winter for as long as the entrance has been open. The people who have lived near these entrances for tens of thousands of years would have felt that breath. They would have understood it as something. What that understanding was, in the specifics of any particular tradition, belongs to the people who hold it. But the breath is real. Stand at the entrance and wait, and you will feel it. That is one of the gifts the underground gives freely, to anyone who approaches it with patience. A cool exhalation from the dark, carrying with it something of the long, still time inside. Let that be the last thing before the outro finds you, the cave breathing, the ancient air moving out into the world above, the underground exhaling all that it knows into the warm hands of whoever is willing to stand still long enough to feel it. Supplementary Chapter K. What three scientists could not agree on? In 1994, three researchers published a joint paper in the Australian Journal of Earth Sciences addressing the formation history of a cave system in the South Australian Mount Lofty Ranges. The paper is not famous. It appeared in a specialist journal with a limited readership, but the argument at the heart of it is worth knowing about because it illustrates something fundamental about the state of cave science in Australia. The three researchers had each studied the same cave using their own methods. One was a geologist specializing in karst formation processes. One was a geochemist who had analyzed the Speleothem formations. One was a hydrologist who had studied the water movement through the cave and the surrounding rock. They had shared their data and attempted to produce a joint account of how the cave had formed, how old it was, and what its future development was likely to be. They could not agree. The geologist's analysis of the passage morphology, the shapes of the tunnels and chambers, suggested a formation history in which the cave developed over a period of approximately 300,000 years, beginning in conditions of high water table and high carbonic acid concentration in the infiltrating water, and progressing through several phases of formation as the water table dropped and the chemistry of the infiltrating water changed. The geochemist's analysis of the Speleothem formations produced a different timeline. The oldest formations that had been dated gave a minimum age for the void they grew in, but the datable material only went back to approximately 180,000 years ago. This did not mean the cave was younger than 180,000 years. It meant that the evidence the geochemist could access did not extend back further than that. The geologist's 300,000-year estimate was not inconsistent with the geochemistry, but it was not supported by it either. The hydrologist's analysis was the most troubling. The water movement patterns in the cave and the surrounding rock did not match either of the other two accounts in a straightforward way. The current hydrology, the way water moved through the system at the time of study, implied a formation history that would have required conditions different from either of the other two accounts during certain periods. Either the previous water chemistry was different from what the geologist predicted, or the passage morphology had developed differently from what the geomorphology suggested. The joint paper published all three analyses and explicitly acknowledged that they could not be reconciled into a single consistent account. The paper ended with a statement that the three authors believed the disagreement was informative, in the sense that it pointed to gaps in the methods available for studying cave formation history, rather than errors in any of the individual analyses. That paper was published 30 years ago. The gaps it identified have been narrowed by subsequent research, but not closed. The cave in the Mount Lofty Ranges was eventually resurveyed, and additional Speleothem samples were dated using improved methods. The results extended the datable record back somewhat further, but did not definitively resolve the formation history in the way the original paper required. The cave still does not have a complete and uncontested account of how it formed. This is not an unusual situation in Australian cave science. It is the normal situation. The methods that are available produce partial answers that overlap imperfectly. The full story of most Australian caves is not yet available to anyone. 3 scientists sat down with their data and tried to write a coherent history of a cave. They failed, honestly, and said so. That honesty is worth more than a false coherence would have been. The cave is what it is. The story of it is still being worked out. In that working out slowly, with imperfect tools and incomplete data, and the constant reminder that the object of study is older and more complex than any single analysis can capture, is where the real knowledge comes from, not from finished accounts. From ongoing attention and the willingness to sit with what you do not yet know. That is where we have been tonight, in the caves, in the dark, with the knowledge that exists and the larger knowledge that does not yet. Following the passages as far as they go with what we have and stopping at the limits with honesty rather than filling the dark with something made up. The caves deserve that. They have been honest with us in their way. Holding what they hold, breathing what they breathe, showing what can be seen. The least we can do is the same. Supplementary Chapter 50. The Color of Underground Time. If you have ever been in a cave with a good torch or a reliable lamp, You will have noticed the color of cave formations. The stalactites are not white the way that chalk is white or the way that fresh paint is white. They are a specific kind of cream or ivory that comes from the mineral itself, from calcite, which is not pure white but has a warmth to it, the kind of warmth you see in old bone or in candle wax that has been near a flame for a long time. The color is the record. The variations in color across a stalactite or stalagmite are not random. They reflect the chemistry of the water that deposited each layer, which reflects the surface conditions at the time that layer was deposited. A layer of calcite that is slightly darker than the surrounding material was deposited when the infiltrating water carried more organic material from the surface, which happened when the surface vegetation was denser, which happened when the rainfall was higher. A layer that is purer white was deposited during a drier period when the water carried less organic carbon. Reading the color variations in a speleothem is reading a climate record, slowly, in the language of mineral chemistry. Australian cave formations have been analysed this way in a number of studies that use the Speleothem record to reconstruct past climate conditions. The results have been significant for understanding the climate history of the continent. The Nullarbor Speleothem record has been used to document rainfall patterns going back several 100,000 years. The Mount Gambier Caves in South Australia have formations that record climate conditions during the last glacial period. The caves of the Kimberley have formations that record the variability of the monsoon system over tens of thousands of years. This is not a mystery. It is one of the most productive applications of cave science, and the results contribute directly to understanding the climate context of human prehistory in Australia. The climate that the first Australians encountered, the climate that changed as the glacial maximum approached and then receded, the climate that accompanied the extinction of the megafauna. All of this is recorded in the color and chemistry of cave formations deposited during those periods. But reading that record requires entering the caves, collecting the formations, cutting them carefully in half to reveal the internal layering, and applying analytical methods that require specialized equipment and expertise. The record is there. The reading of it is slow and expensive and produces results that need to be interpreted carefully against the limitations of the dating methods and the sampling strategies. Every stalactite in every Australian cave is an archive. The slow drip of time made visible in the calcite layers, in the color variations that preserve the memory of rain and drought and cold and warmth. Going back further than the formations can be dated with current methods. The caves are keeping this record whether anyone reads it or not. They have been keeping it for longer than we have been here to read it. And they will keep it in the dark long after we are done with the reading, for whoever comes next and wants to know what the weather was like in Australia 100,000 years ago. The answer is in the color of the stone, waiting patiently in the dark as it has always been.